Welcome to Strip Cover, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Andrew Ford, and we are putting the finishing touches on another year of literary duty. And yesterday we finished up the top 20 poems that I have featured on the channel this year. And today we are kicking off the top 10 short stories featured on the channel this year. So let's go ahead and get right into it with number 10. This video will be from 10 through 6. This video will appear in the short story discussion playlist here on the channel. Also, the top 5 playlist on the channel, a little bit misleading, but there are only 5 short stories featured in each of these videos. So, number 10 was Simplica Girl Diaries by George Saunders. And for each of these, I have stolen a summary from Somewhere About the Internet. The Somewhere About the Internet for this one was Wikipedia. The narrator, a middle-class father living a safe but unfulfilling life, attempts to please his daughter Lily and compete with a wealthier family by buying her various lavish gifts. These include Simplica girls, when trafficked from third-world countries to be used as human lawn ornaments. His sensitive younger daughter Ava frees the Simplica girls, a felony. The loss of the Simplica girls puts the family in severe debt. In confronting the legal and financial hardships he now faces, the narrator learns of the more severe challenges faced by the Simplica girls in their home countries. This is a short story that I have really valued since the very first time that I read it, way back when this collection was new. It came out. I don't remember if I was in my undergrad year or if I was doing my master's at the time, but it came out. I got it brand new, and this story was one of the ones that really stood out for me. Apparently, there is an adaptation in the works for one of these streaming platforms, but I don't know which one. And this short story is, I think, probably the best way to get purchase on this collection if you are having trouble finding your way into the voice of George Saunders, figuring out what it is that George Saunders does or how you should read George Saunders. I think that this short story is the best example of maybe best example of is not the way to start this. The Simplica Girl Diaries is the easiest way to figure out an inroad to 10th of December by George Saunders. That is the collection overall. I think that there are a lot of things worth talking about with this short story. One of them is the sort of obvious parallel to the real world with girls who are online camera models. I think that you can examine this short story through imagining that the Simplica girls are cam girls. And do we feel different about their plight because of that? Another way to think of this short story is that I think we don't feel that men in similar conditions are victimized. So the military is largely masculine. Men go off and they fight in wars. I think that they do not get the same type of consideration that this story offers to these hypothetical women. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that where I think the divide is in the mind of George Saunders. Women on the battlefield would get the same sympathy that men do. There's not as many women on the battlefield. Young men going off and working on oil derricks in the middle of the ocean. Wherever it is that young men are going off to try to build a fortune for their family. I don't think we consider them in terms that are necessarily sympathetic, right? So maybe I'm wrong, and you are more than welcome to argue with me over that, but it seems to me that this short story is saying quite the opposite. So it's an interesting way to read the story. That's the only point I'm really making here. The number 9 short story here was The Ghost Eater from H.P. Lovecraft. The Ghost Eater is a story where a character encounters a mysterious, monstrous creature that appears to consume ghosts, often described as a shadowy, otherworldly entity that feeds on the spectral remnants of the dead. The narrative usually focuses on the protagonist's terrifying experiences as they try to understand and escape the creature's presence, often set in dark and unsettling atmosphere. So, not a great summary of the short story, but it is, unfortunately, perhaps about as precise a summary of the short story as the short story itself is a description of whatever it is that happened therein. Now, I say that in a semi-judgmental way, but I do not mean it in a judgmental way. I think that that is part of the atmosphere to this short story that makes it so alluring, that there is this sort of fringe idea of the reality, and we are being exposed to something that we have to question all the while. Was this my first? This may have been my first exposure to H.P. Lovecraft. If not, I think I did 3 short stories and a poem from Lovecraft this past October, and this was my favorite of the group. I can't remember the exact chronology right now, but this may have been my very first exposure to H.P. Lovecraft. Not what I was expecting, honestly. Everything in the back of my mind, and I didn't read the great big ones. I didn't read anything about Cthulhu, etc. The Necronomicon, but everything in the back of my mind wanted to place his diction and storytelling methods alongside Edgar Allan Poe, and I don't know why. H.P. Lovecraft felt much, 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 much more current than Edgar Allan Poe, and I was not prepared for that. I did like it. I did like the H.P. Lovecraft that I read, except for the poem. I didn't think the poem was good, but it was. I have no idea if that's one of his better poems or better known poems. It was about Halloween in the suburbs or something like that. I can't remember precisely right now, but wasn't a big fan of that. Now, we have Escape from Spiderhead by George Saunders, another short story which has its own adaptation. I believe this is on Netflix. This one's going to take a while because it is in depth. Jeff is a convicted murderer who is a part of a drug experimentation study. A man named Absentee gives Jeff and a female prisoner, Heather, a drug which makes them find each other incredibly attractive, and when they previously didn't. Jeff and Heather have sex on the couch, and Absentee observes them through a one-way mirror. Absentee then gives them another drug to make them feel normally about one another. Absentee repeats this process with Jeff and another female prisoner, Rachel. Jeff feels sad that the love he felt in both cases was manipulated and not real. Absentee takes Jeff to the control room deemed Spiderhead and asks him to pick between Rachel and Heather, one of whom Absentee will give an incredibly painful drug called Darkenflox. Jeff cannot decide, so Absentee says neither of the women will be given the drug, and he tells Jeff that he has helped to solve the world problems through his participation in the study. Now, he says, humans have the ability to tone affection and love up or down as needed, which could end wars or cure heartbreak. Jeff is placed in a room with a guy named Rogan. Jeff realizes Heather has had sex with both himself and Rogan while under the influence of the love drug and is now being asked to decide which of the men will receive Darkenflox. Neither of the men receive it, and the same process repeats itself as Rachel makes the same decision as Heather. Jeff is put in a room with Keith and finds out that Keith has also had sex with Heather and Rachel. Over the PA, Absentee is angry with Jeff because he messed with the experimental design integrity through his communication with the other study participants. The next day, Absenti tells Jeff that his inability to decide whom to give Darkenflocks to didn't convince the superiors and that Jeff has no residual feelings of love for either woman. Instead, Heather will be given Darkenflocks and Jeff will be given drugs for eloquence and truthfulness and have to watch and narrate his feelings. Near the end of the time period, Heather kills herself. Absenti tells Jeff that he must repeat the process with Rachel and gives Jeff Rachel's file to read. Rachel murdered 3 people. Jeff remembers that he murdered someone with a brick in a fight, and his mother paid for him to be in this lab rather than real prison. He refuses to help give Rachel the Darkenflocks. Absenti wants to give Jeff a drug to force him to agree, but due to the drug's classification, he needs to get approval. Absenti leaves, and Jeff uses Absenti's remote to give the Darkenflocks to himself. He would rather die than murder Rachel. So, this is a long summary of the short story. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a way to summarize this short story in a quick fashion. That is, I don't think, a flaw of the short story. I think that this is just an intricate story that has to be told the way it is told. This short story is maybe my second favorite from George Saunders overall from everything that I've read. Maybe. It's a good one, and it is intricate, it is involved, but the elements that George Saunders brings into this, the characters having a past that is dark, the characters that are given this second chance, not at life, but at usefulness, right? Testing these drugs is useful, but they're not free. They're not free to walk about. They are given drugs that would make them more verbose, which is interesting because verbosity in this story correlates with freedom of emotion. I think a lot of people who consider themselves creative types with the word, with the pen, understand maybe the truth behind that. The freedom of emotion that is employed or deployed, depending on how you want to look at things, when you know more words. I think that is interesting. I think that it is interesting to see put on in a short story such as this in this way, especially when you're talking about characters that are not the most, how would you say, the most clean cut. We'll just put it that way. I think that a lot of the George Saunders that you read, the characters are all kind of the same. And that kind of hurts George Saunders' writing, in my opinion. Here, I think that there are plenty of differences between these characters, and maybe the best characterization of any of George Saunders that I have read besides Sea Oak. If you have not read Sea Oak, definitely worth reading. The next short story on this list, number 7, Paranoia by Shirley Jackson. In Manhattan, businessman Mr. Halloran Beresford leaves his office happy and jolly after his busy day at work, pleased with remembering his wife's birthday. He buys chocolates on the way home and plans to take his wife out to a romantic dinner and a show. But on his commute home, he repeatedly comes across a man in a light hat who he believes is stalking him. Trying to escape the man, he is repeatedly accosted by other strangers who seem to be a part of the plot. Finally, he arrives home where his wife comforts him, only to lock him in the room and make a phone call saying, "Listen, he came here after all. I've got him." Dun, dun, dun. This is one of many of Shirley Jackson's stories that has an air of paranoia about it. In the best way possible, you could see Shirley Jackson's short stories, many of them, as episodes of The Twilight Zone in the best way possible. Anyone who has seen The Twilight Zone or loves The Twilight Zone understands that as a compliment, when normally it is not a compliment to say that someone's show could be, or someone's short story could appear on a skit show. This short story, in my opinion, has some interesting commentary on masculinity. The lead character, Mr. Beresford, is constantly commenting on other men's height. He's constantly commenting on other men's facial hair, or lack thereof, or lack of his own facial hair. And the whole thing at the end of the story is basically whether or not he can make his wife happy. It turns out he must not be making his wife happy because she is in collusion with all of these other men. It is a very interesting short story from that perspective. I believe that is the only alternative reading that I have ever put on the short story. That one sticks out to me so much that it seems natural for that short story. But the thing with Shirley Jackson's work is The Lottery, for example. You kind of get a reading of it and you think, oh, okay, well, that's a neat short story. And then someone will say something about it that you never considered, and it becomes a completely different short story. A lot of Shirley Jackson's work is that way. A lot of Shirley Jackson's work is painted with such fine brushes that once you see it in a certain fashion, that is your interpretation. But someone else has to shake the painting for you to be able to look at it in a different light. Now, this is an unfortunate truth about Shirley Jackson. Not all of her stuff is out there in the way that it should be. So there was no summary, for the Arabian Nights on the internet. The Arabian Nights is a story about a girl who is it her birthday, I believe, maybe? And the parents, neighbors / friend couple are over and they ask her what she wants to do. And she says to celebrate, she wants to go to the Arabian Nights. It is a nightclub, so everyone's a little bit iffy about it. But they go, and they're watching a sort of maybe burlesque show. We have a little bit of an explanation about what's going on the stage, and someone that the adults in the group think is Clark Gable comes in and sits across the way. And they tell her, hey, birthday girl, go say hi to Clark Gable. Maybe he'll invite us over because it's your birthday. And she's too embarrassed to go. And before she can work up the gusto to do it, the person who may or may not have been Clark Gable is leaving. And everyone is not upset with her, but disappointed. I think that there are probably a million ways to read this short story. I think that there are probably 1,000,001 ways to interpret this short story. It is a very well-written short story, but within the weeds of the writing is an interpretation for this short story I did not expect to find. In the weeds of the writing in this short story, the girl, who is somewhere like preteen, so probably post-pubescent, but pre-adult, somewhere in there, right? I think that's generally what the term preteen means. I've never had children, so don't crucify me for misinterpreting that. So she's not an adult. She has very direct communication with her parents, with the husband in her parents' friend group, right? So here she is, here's her parents, here's her parents' friends. The husband here, she has very direct communication with that seems to be, to some reading, maybe inappropriate. And that interpretation, I tried to read myself out of it. That interpretation is certainly there. So once I kind of got that reading, like there are certainly interpretations to be had in this short story about wanting to be someone. I think that's very real and alive in this short story. There are interpretations about coming into adulthood and how all of us sort of in that stage where we are post-pubescent, pre-adult, we are mimicking what we think adults do, what adults are. That's all in there. The middle class suburbia, maybe upper middle class suburbia thing, that's all in there. I think that there are probably readings about urban versus suburban or city versus rural to be had in the short story. I haven't done a whole lot of work there, but the very unfortunate type of interpretation that I talked about, that is certainly there, and that was where I circled most of the video that I did about this short story on the channel. There are videos for all of these short stories on the channel added to the short story discussion playlist this year. So that's what I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week, and I hope to have you back for the next one.